When reading the lessons for this week, I was so excited that I had actually visited 2 of the places mentioned within the last year that I misproofed the bulletin and didn't have the right lesson included. Which is why Mr. Simcox was kind enough to read that wonderful lesson from 1 Kings. Although I had just last year been in the country of the Gerasenes, that is, in the Golan Heights, just on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee from Tiberias, where this demoniac, where the church remembers this demoniac being healed. I've preached on that before. I thought, but I was just in Egypt. So indulge me a long story, okay? The day, it started at 1:45 a.m. Not at 3 a.m., which would have been terrible. Not at 4 a.m., which would have been bearable. But at 1:45 a.m., with the blaring out of one of the 3 alarms that I had set for myself so as not to oversleep that day's events. I threw on some clothes because, after all, it didn't matter what they looked like. It was 1:45 in the morning, and we were in the middle of the Sinai desert. And I climbed the stairs of the monastery to join my fellow pilgrims who were all bleary-eyed like me, but excited. And we walked out past the monastery and out into an open field known as the camel parking lot. Indeed, it was a lot, and there were camels sitting all around it. And a crowd of Bedouin men stood there waiting for us. And immediately they started sizing us up, literally sizing us up. They had to decide which one of our group would best fit with each one of their camels and saddles. And within about 30 seconds of arriving, a young Bedouin man appeared before me out of the darkness, grabbed me by the hand, and started dragging me back out into the darkness. Now, thankfully, we'd been warned about this process, and so I knew this forceful jerk into the night was just normal game. And he pointed me to this camel that was sitting on the ground, kneeling, as they do, on the ground, and motioned for me to get on. And so I climbed on and I squeezed into the saddle. If you've ever ridden a camel, you'll know and remember that camel saddles are very tight. They are meant to keep you from falling off the camel and thus off the side of the mountain and to your death. So we like that they're tight. And I could hear my fellow pilgrims in the darkness around me because my guide, after getting me settled on my camel, left me all by myself on a camel, sitting on the ground in the darkness. It was probably 2:15 by this point. I could hear some rumbling around me. I could see flashlights flashing every once in a while, knowing that the rest of the members of my group were getting the same treatment as had I. And then a minute or 2 later, he came back and he switched me onto another camel, not explaining anything. And a minute or 2 after that, he came back and he switched me onto another camel, not explaining anything. They were shifting us all around, finding from doing this every day which ones of us were the right fit for their camels. It's important to note they didn't really care about our comfort in all of this. It was the comfort of their camels that mattered. And since they are their livelihood, I can understand that. And so then for 2 hours, under the desert stars, we rode our camels as they made their way up Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, as we hear it described in today's lesson from 1 Kings. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet or not, but camels are not comfortable. They are significantly wider than are our hips. And so our legs get splayed out in these awkward angles on either side, quite an unnatural position. And your feet dangling there at your sides. There aren't stirrups like on a horse, and your feet dangling there on the, because if they were, you'd be in stirrups sticking straight out on either side. And so your feet there are dangling, and they quickly go numb if you don't learn to tuck them up behind you like the camel jockeys do. And if not that, then you have to constantly squeeze the muscles in your legs and your feet so that they won't fall asleep. And have I mentioned yet that the saddles are tight? There is a huge knot in the front of you and a knot behind you. Granted, they keep you alive, but that also means that every time the camel has to pass one of these spillways that's built into the trail to keep the occasional rains from completely washing the trail out. Every time the camel steps down into a spillway, you cram forward into your saddle. And every time he or she steps out of the spillway, you cram backwards into the other side. Only a little movement, but enough to be extraordinarily uncomfortable. But after all, I was on a camel. And I didn't care how uncomfortable it was, because I was in the Sinai, riding up Mount Sinai, y'all. This doesn't happen every day. You know, where Moses met with the Lord God in the thunder and the clouds and the lightning, and the whole Milky Way stretched out over our heads. And we arrived high up on this mountain, not quite at the top, when we were let off our camels. And then in this little tea hut perched on the side of the mountain, we had coffee made fresh for us by another young Bedouin fellow, or at least as fresh as instant coffee can be, because Nescafe rules this part of the world. And we walked then a little ways up the trail and around a large rock outcropping to find a quiet spot from which to look out over the desert and the mountains, and there we sat silently waiting for the sun to rise. And the sun rose, but behind clouds, which muted that early morning show. And then I turned to the group there and prepared to celebrate the Eucharist, and our Muslim guides sitting quietly and reverently to the side as we completed our Christian ritual on this mountain sacred to 3 Abrahamic faiths. And after communion, some of us then continued up to the very top of Mount Sinai. It was 750 brutal stone steps. And so halfway up, as we were contemplating whether we would actually make it or not and catching our breath, we turned around and looked out over the desert, and I happened to look down. And there, just below us, right close to where we had celebrated the Eucharist just a little before, was this tiny green little oasis amidst all of the brown and stone of that mountain. That is the Vale of Elijah, the place where the church remembers Elijah's encounter with God, about which we hear in our lesson from 1 Kings today. And it was that lush, tiny little veil that caught my imagination and drew me in. It was a place of refuge, a place of life in the midst of such harshness all around us in every direction. And so, it hadn't been the camel, though that was an adventure, and it hadn't been the sunrise, though that had been peaceful, and it hadn't been in celebrating the Eucharist, though that surely had been a bucket list moment for me. And it hadn't even been at the summit, which is what I had expected, meeting God on God's holy mountain like Moses had, in wind and dramatic scenery. No, the holiest moment caught me off guard in a quiet and unexpected glance down. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. That's what Elijah experienced in that little green veil. Richard Coles writes about a time when a particular piece of music had become the soundtrack of his life. You know how those, we've talked about earworms in my sermons before, those pieces get stuck with us and are with us day and night for a week at a time. And writing of this music, he says, it's very beautiful and I've been playing it quite a bit while I work, and it's crept into my consciousness so that I find that I'm anticipating the tune correctly, but the dynamics, that is, how loud or how soft, inaccurately, paying half attention instead of full attention. And so when I hum along, I suddenly burst out too loud, thinking brass, when in fact it's flutes. One commentator writes that, I love Cole's image of thinking of brass when in fact it's flutes. I think about how often we're sort of aware of God's presence, but we miss God's voice, gentle and inviting, because we may be throwing ourselves into noise. Elijah's story and Cole's reminds us that if we miss the flutes, if we miss stepping out of the noise and into the quiet, we miss the powerful, enwrapping voice of God that draws us into mystery and beauty. When God shouts, it amazes us. When God whispers, we are drawn into God's heart. I had expected and been listening for God to shout at me at the top of Mount Sinai. I was caught off guard when God whispered to me below the summit and while looking down instead of up. For Cole, it wasn't the brass, but the flutes, and his realization that he'd been expecting one in the place of the other. For Elijah, it wasn't the great wind or the earthquake or the fire that drew him in, though they certainly must have amazed him. It was the silence. You know, camelback adventures are meant to be enjoyed. And the fireworks of creation, wind, earthquake, fire, sunrises, stars, they are indeed amazing, and God is surely present in it all. But why might we be more intentional about making space to be caught off guard by the whisper of God calling to us? It's a whisper that speaks directly to our hearts and causes us to lean in closer to try to hear better. And it might very well come to us when we're looking down instead of looking up.